Feeling like a shark in a shrimp tank. Big fish, small pond in the shrimp tank.
Welcome back to another episode of the Shrimp Tank. We come to you virtually from Seattle and the entire Pacific Northwest. Listen, if you want to learn how to start, grow, or run a successful business, you've come to the right place. This is where we like to say street smarts and book smarts collide. Hello again, everyone. I'm Dan Whedon, and I'm joined by my co-host, the incomparable Michelle Bomberger. Our guest today is Chris Hare, and I'm really looking forward to talking to Chris. He is the founder and principal of the Storied Future, where Chris helps CEOs transform themselves, their companies, and their industries through the power of narrative. His current and past clients include FTD, Amazon, Microsoft Worldwide Energy, and Outreach. He is also the host of the Storied Future podcast, which I just started listening to, and it's great. And he leads storytelling pro bono for the Bar X Project, a nonprofit serving combat wounded Marines. I want to hear about that too. Chris and his wife, Michelle, live in Fall City with their two teenagers, Ethan and Ebby. Chris, welcome to the show. We'll be with you in just a minute. Everyone, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We're on iHeartRadio. In fact, we're the #3 entrepreneur podcast on iHeartRadio. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher. Craig would want me to say Overcast, of course, and then YouTube. You can say we are ubiquitous. Now, before we bring on Chris to talk about stories, hello there, Michelle.
Hey, Dan. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. Good to see you. You know, I was doing a little research on Chris, and I started thinking back to my high school days for some reason, actually even probably junior high days. It seemed back then, I know you're going to find this hard to believe, Michelle, but I got in trouble for talking. I don't know. I don't know if you're shocked to hear that, but I would get in trouble for talking during class. I liked to tell stories. I still like to tell stories, especially when we have family gatherings like Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like that, or anytime anybody will listen to me. So my question for you before I dive into why I even bring that up is I got to believe at some point in high school, you had a small, I don't know, vice or two that teachers didn't like. Mine was talking. What was yours?
Wow. Asking for vulnerability so early.
This is the plead. The fifth section of our part of it, Michelle.
I was actually thinking exactly that. You know, I grew up in a relatively small community. Everyone knew everyone else. And so it was kind of hard to keep secrets. But I also had very trusting parents. And so I got away with a lot. School wasn't my problem so much, but I did get away with a lot. And much later in life, shared some of those things with my parents, who were, shocked at the fact that that those happened behind their back. So I will plead the fifth and just share that we all have our vices.
All right. I can't believe I got Michelle Bomberger to plead the fifth. That made this whole podcast right away. Well, Chris Hare, first of all, welcome to the show. I want to ask you, you're a storyteller. Like I said, I've listened a little bit to your most recent podcast as I was doing some preparation work for this and looking at your history. I got to believe that you're a raconteur yourself, obviously, telling stories. Does that go back to your youth like it did for me? Were you somebody who talked a lot in school? And tell us how you got into this storytelling, into your career as a storyteller.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It was funny, in my early 30s, I was on a trip with someone who's now a good friend. And we're in a hotel room one night after a long day of work in this production. And he looks at me and he says, has anyone ever told you that you talk too much? And thought, no one ever has. But that's what I grew up around, is a lot of people talking a lot and telling a lot of stories. We'd sit around the table and just swap story after story, or puns. My dad would throw out a topic and we would just go around the table until we all ran out of puns, but it was just constant storytelling. But I think for me, it took probably after that conversation with that friend who I didn't think of as a friend in that moment in my early 30s, and then over time realizing that one of the most important keys to storytelling is listening. And for me, the piece I'm not most passionate about is not telling stories myself, but looking and listening for stories and giving other people a voice and helping them tell their story in a way that transforms them. So
Well, that's a great segue into your business and kind of what do you do? And I just noticed just recently you kind of pivoted the business. So you started in 2016 and recently have switched gears. Can you talk a little bit about that journey as an entrepreneur, from kind of your historical experience to what you've learned and where you are today?
yeah, absolutely. So I started in the advertising world. I did a career transition in my early 30s, started in advertising then. Went from the ad agency to Amazon. So at Amazon, I owned acquisition through year one on Amazon Marketplace. So storytelling, brand storytelling, content, built their entrepreneur storytelling program there. Went from there to Microsoft. And as you mentioned, I left in 2016, started the Storied Future. And really as content marketing is where I started. And essentially what happened is, we talk about narratives, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, a fair amount today, is I had a narrative in my mind around what a business should look like and built a business model around that. And I'm not an operator. That's like, I'm, an advisor. That's the ideal role for me, versus building an agency and growing it. And so what happened is I built this model, and then all kinds of challenges hit along the way, but I was essentially trying to sell Bugattis to people who wanted Jettas, and there's nothing wrong with Jettas, but the financial model of my clients of the world, the Amazons, the Microsofts, et cetera, is all about, within the content world and content marketing world, it's all about, efficiency and building kind of a supply chain model. So it's about building a velocity and volume of things versus building the Bugatti, right? And so that made it very challenging to have consistency and growth. And then you combine that, just as a side note, I left the tech world with some significant mental health challenges. Well, I had them going in, but it made it a lot worse. And so I have to be incredibly picky about who I work with. And so the amount of revenue that I've had to turn down because they're just not people that I can work with made that entire system incredibly fragile. And so then when 2020 ultimately hits, and when 2020 was over, I was like, oh, great, it's going to pick up again. And last year was unbelievably bad. And then this year, with budgets evaporating overnight, at the biggest tech companies in the world, and on the startup side, our money's in Silicon Valley Bank and it evaporates overnight, that kind of a thing. That's where I started to, I really started to think about the reinvention and the pivot last year. And really the catalyst for that was starting my podcast, which I really did as brand building, because outside of Seattle, very few people know who I am. And so I needed to be out of the small pond and in the big ocean. But I also started, so the hook with the podcast is really around, the concept of the company, the Storied Future, is really around leaders who've put a new narrative out into the world and then use that narrative to shift the future. Where I ran into, so there were business model challenges, and then I way overbuilt the company because I built out the systems and processes that you'd need for a very large agency. And I've had people tell me who freelance with very large agencies that we blow these agencies away in terms of our processes. But I sunk all of that money and a lot of money into that. And then I'm just sitting on all of that sunk costs, right? And so start this podcast, and I thought the podcast was really about elevating me to get more to the chief marketing officer level, because I was working at a lot of mid-level marketers. And ultimately what I found what I discovered of where I need to be playing and where my relaunch is now focused is really around CEOs and their narratives. And so there's been a lot of ahas, but the big aha the big thing that really pushed me in this direction was a few years ago. I worked with a company in Kirkland, Washington called Applicant Commerce, and they were going through totally getting disrupt their whole paint distributor, like their paint distributor, the whole industry was getting disrupted by e-commerce and lots of channel conflict, and worked with them to build a narrative that was translating their business strategy into a narrative that everyone can align around, from their suppliers to their employees to their retailers and then also their customers that they were now selling to. So built that narrative, and seeing, when they took it to Sherwin-Williams, is the biggest brand on the planet, they said, this is the most aggressive narrative we've ever heard. It's like we're getting punched in the face and we love it. So that was cool. That was good for the ego. But the part that was actually really meaningful was when their COO said to me, Chris, if you walk around the office, you'll see the narrative at everyone's desk and they're all learning it. And if you go across the country to our warehouses, where like everyone all the way down to the warehouse is learning it and using it. It's something everyone can wrap their brains around. Right. So coming into this year, there's just a few key events that I'll share that has kind of finally took me over into the shift. Was one of my podcast guests last year, Pete Sauerborn. We worked together at Amazon. He became ultimately the VP of Amazon Marketplace. And after the podcast, after I interviewed him last year, he became the exec chair of FTD, the flower company. So they had been purchased by private equity prior to COVID, and they were flying really high at the beginning when we were all sending each other flowers in the first couple of weeks, because we thought, oh, this isn't going to last long. But they soon hit a headwind. And so they brought him in to really turn things around. And January of this year hit, and through a series of events that I won't explain here, it'll be on a podcast this episode, because I want him to, it's a little bit sensitive, but essentially he had to parachute in with 5 days notice into the CEO seat. So this CEO's gone overnight. Pete parachutes in. No one knows who he is outside of the board and the executive team, and immediately has to change the strategy, do layoffs, and turn things around. And what was fascinating is this wasn't intended, but he used the podcast episode that I did to earn trust with the board, with employees, with his executive team, and with the florists. And then I also advised him in the week or two, like before and then, when he was starting to get in with the company around his narrative. And he's an extraordinary business leader. I'm not taking credit for this, but what was remarkable is what he did was turn them around, most profitable quarter ever, led a merger, and handed off to a new CEO all inside of 6 months, which is nuts, absolutely nuts, right? But during that process, we were coaching each other, and he's one that really said, this is where you need to focus, is really on the CEO narrative, and how do you translate your business strategy into a narrative that aligns everyone from the board to the front lines and beyond. But there was still a missing piece for me, which is, okay, how do you bring in the personal transformation piece? Because what's happened in the podcast, like what my superpower is not doing what I'm doing right now. It's pulling someone else's story out and basically earning their trust so that they open up and tell me their story. And so this has happened over and over again on the podcast, where I want to talk about I'm interviewing them about business transformation. And there's this hunger to talk about personal transformation as well. And so can I give an example story, or are we good on, is that?
Well, I just want to.
Go ahead. I'm talking a lot, so jump in.
No, that's okay. I think it's fascinating. There's one thing that kind of keeps popping into my head just for clarification, and somebody listening might have that as well. And it's defining what narrative means. Yep. What is a CEO narrative? It's really, I think, the first time that I've heard that. And when you say not transitions, but melds with a company narrative. So can we talk a little bit about what narrative actually means?
Yeah. So, I'll tell you what a story is first, and then I'll tell you what a narrative is. And they're used interchangeably a lot. And, but it's helpful. What I found is helpful is to kind of parse them out. So a story is, in the example that I just shared, or So actually, let me use the paint company for an example, because there's a full case study and podcast episode on this that your listeners can look at, right? So a specific story in their instance would be in their situation would be the CEO might say, "Hey, the SVP of sales said, hey, I got a phone call this morning from a retailer who is incredibly upset that we've opened our own e-commerce because they believe we're competing with them." So that is a story. The narrative in that instance, in the mind of the retailer, that story is for them evidence, right? And they collect different stories. We all do this. We collect evidence and stories as we go through our lives. The narrative for them used to be, hey, this distributor is our best friend, and we've worked together for 60 years, and we're going to be working together forever. And I can trust that the way we've been doing business in the channels that we've been doing business is always going to stay the same. So that's the narrative. It's the framework that we take our stories and translate those stories into, and that narrative shapes our beliefs, our identities, our behaviors, and our actions, right? So you can imagine in a world with the paint company where you have suppliers, because of the disruptions with the Amazons and Walmarts of the world, et cetera, are now managing 100 different marketplaces. So they're overwhelmed, and they have stories, all kinds of stories that then shape their narratives of how they view that. They have a narrative of how they view the distributor, and have for 60 years, which is, we give you the paint brushes, you mark them up, you sell them. And now there needs to be a new and different narrative, right? So the question then becomes, okay, the client has a business strategy they need to execute on. There's a ton of uncertainty in the environment. So for example, fill rates on orders, they prided themselves on being at like 97, 98% fill rates historically. And then with supply chain issues, now they're down in the 70s, right? And there's nothing they can do about that. So what is the narrative that they can own? And so conceptually, the way that I approach it, and with the concept of the storied future, is, what is the differentiated future that we can create with our customers and with our suppliers and with our employees that we are uniquely equipped to deliver on, right? And thinking about that as this kind of center of gravity that propels everyone. So it's not to say that this narrative that we're creating, and the narrative really is kind of a pathway that we want to follow along and pull everyone along on. It's not to say that the narrative means that everyone will win. Like, we know that's not the way business will work, but it's creating a world that's kind of a Venn of, like, what does each person or party want, and what is each person and party's values. And by saying, okay, this is the place we're going to play, we're going to, in this Venn, we're going to play here, and it gives everyone an opportunity to win. Or it could be that our values actually exclude people, or our business strategy excludes people, and that's okay. That's a choice that we're making, right? But that's what business strategies are, is making a choice of where to play and how to win, right? And so for them, what the narrative boiled down to, and there's drill down versions, but it's simply win the cart. So what that means is that's the one thing every single person wants. The supplier knows that wherever their paintbrush shows up on Amazon, on Walmart, et cetera, or on a store shelf, that they are going to get that brush. They want that brush to be put in someone's cart as quickly as possible, right? And then the same thing, that's what the retailer wants on the physical side. And then for our customer, that's what they want. But then there's values and principles that shape that drive the execution of the business plan, business strategy.
Chris, that's fascinating. It really, really is. And I know we have more questions for you, but we got to pay the bills. We're going to take a short break to hear from today's Spotlight sponsor. And when we come back with our guest, Chris Hare, for our Hot or Not section of the show, we're going to find out if disruption and narratives work in the shrimp tank. Don't walk away. We'll be right back with more of the Shrimp Tank.
At Equinox, we believe in the power of law to give business leaders the freedom and confidence to go boldly into the unknown. Entrepreneurs don't trust that lawyers can be affordable, accessible, or offer a strategic advantage. Law feels like a complicated cost that only the megacorps can afford, so they often go at it alone. We imagine a world where entrepreneurs have the same strategic advantage of law as the megacorps. Equinox makes it possible for all business leaders to have a general counsel on their team to support both strategic and tactical legal needs, knowing where you've been and where you're going, and guiding you on how best to achieve your goals while protecting what you've built, with an all-inclusive, fixed-price legal solution tailored to your business. There's no more worry about how much legal will cost or if you'll even get a response. Instead, you have a relationship with your legal team, access to legal support whenever you need it, and the freedom and confidence to take your business boldly forward. Our relationship starts with a complimentary business health assessment. Complete the 5-minute survey at equinox.law, and you'll immediately get a 30-page report to help you and your team prioritize the legal infrastructure you need to move your business forward. Plus a complimentary consultation with our corporate counsel to walk through the report together and understand what your business needs now and for its future. Now's the time to invest in your business and go boldly forward with legal on your team. Equinox Business Law Group, strategic legal counsel for all.
Welcome back to the Shrimp Tank, where we interview the best and brightest CEOs and business thought leaders in the greater Puget Sound area and beyond. I'm Michelle Bomberger here with Dan Whedon and our guest today, Chris Hare from the Storied Future. Let's kick off our next segment, Hot or Not.
All right, Chris, hot or not is where Michelle and I pepper you with questions about business, about life, about a whole bunch of different things. You're going to tell us whether it's hot or not, and then why or why not. At the end, you win absolutely nothing, but we hope you have some fun. I mentioned disruption and all of that in the Shrimp Tank. Sounds like you work with larger companies. Hot or not, the same process that you just talked about, the narratives and all of that for small businesses.
Hot, absolutely. And that's part of what I work on is people that are disrupting and transforming industries. Where I prefer to work is ones where there is a gigantic change, where it could take 10, 25, 50 years, but absolutely hot.
All right, I'll add hot or not, executive vulnerability.
Warm. No, it's hot. So absolutely important, but needs to be done in a really wise way. There's a lot of, I think what I see is people tend to not be as vulnerable as they should, but there's also a danger, and you see a lot of this on LinkedIn, of people oversharing. And so it's thinking about, when I have people on the podcast, there are things that I will edit out, not the vulnerability piece. I won't edit that out, but sometimes there are phrases or words here or there that could, set people off. And so you just have to be really careful and intentional. That doesn't mean scripting things. In some cases, maybe you need to do that. So yes, vulnerability is hot, but with caution.
So I'm going to give you a really softball here because I know what the answer is, but I want you to expound upon it. Hot or not, podcasting, having your own podcast.
Hot, but I'll tell you maybe an answer you weren't expecting.
Okay.
So for me, one of the most important parts, or some of the best value I've gotten out of podcasting, is it's incredibly selfish, but it's my personal transformation because of the people that I get to talk to and how that's actually impacted me in the direction of my business. So I guarantee you that I either wouldn't have done this pivot, or actually, no, I can guarantee you I wouldn't have done this pivot if I had not been doing the podcast. So that's first and foremost, is about me and my transformation. And then the second piece for me is really around, I always tell my guests that they're the most important audience. And you'll see in my podcast this season where I'm starting to talk to academics around the research around storytelling and narrative. But when we tell our story, it transforms us and transforms other people. So those are my two favorite parts of podcasting, but definitely hot.
Love that. And, this is not really a hot or not transition, but it feeds off of the last two questions. And that's really about kind of mental health in the workplace and the awareness of people in the workplace. I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about how that vulnerability and kind of awareness of where people are coming from in their world, how that's maybe influenced your storytelling, your business model, and your customers.
Yeah. So, and this again, I'm going to credit the experience I'm having with the podcast, but there's For the longest time, I believed because of my lived experience and because of what I saw with others, that there needed to be effectiveness coupled with kindness and humanity and strong values. But what's interesting is if you look at, there was a study that shows that narcissistic CEOs make more money, right? So it's not, and they could tell you like, hey, I don't have to be kind to win, right? But I was struck once. I was down at Sun River in Oregon once, and I met this gentleman that was probably around 80. And we started talking, and he'd been an animator at Disney for decades. And so he started listing off film after film, and it was every film you've ever heard of that he worked on, right? And what struck me is, who knows how he lived his life, right? But what struck me is, there are a lot of people in this world that's all we have at the end, right? Is our accomplishments or how effective we were, right? And so what's really cool is to see what's coming out in the research now. So I had Jim Citron, who's the leader of the CEO practice at Spencer Stewart, their research with Herminia Ibarra, who's at London Business School. I had her on yesterday. It's really they call it, her article is called The Leadership Odyssey. And what it's showing is this convergence where it's being more and more like a requirement to be both effective and have strong values that respect people and bring other people along on the journey. And it's becoming harder and harder for people to succeed who are bottom line jerks, right? So for me, where, when I relaunched, the focus for me and what I'm really passionate about is really around when a CEO gets to the finish line of their career, are they not, like, I want them to be proud, not just of what they've accomplished, but of how they've accomplished it, who they brought with them and who they've become in the process. And so what's cool is my favorite example is actually Pete Sauerborn, because I've known him the longest. So I met him in 2013 when I started at Amazon. And I can share this because it's coming out on the podcast this season. But I told him on this forthcoming episode, I said, Pete, when we worked together, people were terrified of you, not because you were mean. You're this, the best business leader I've ever worked for, but people were terrified because you were an automaton. Right. And what was fascinating is to hear about I've observed his transformation to becoming much more human and empathetic, but he's also observing it. And what's fascinating is when he took the podcast interview that I did last year, and he said the first person he sent it to was his mom, and then someone had to go over there to show his mom how to play it on the iPhone. But what was interesting is he said hearing his own story and how he tells this story is transforming him, right, and shifting him. And so I've seen that shift in him, which I think is really powerful, because I used to believe that adults don't change, and to be honest, a lot don't, right? But that was a narrative that I had, and I had to go through my own very significant transformation on the personal side. And so realizing that, hey, change actually is possible, and then finding people who really want that change is kind of where I'm at now. So
Chris, it's so interesting to me. We're talking about vulnerability, and I might date myself. It feels like going back to when I was just getting into the workforce 30 some odd years ago. Vulnerability, that wasn't ever shown by leaders. I think there's a fear, and maybe it's just a human fear, that at some level, if I tell people of my failures, they're going to think less of me. And so there's this fear of, okay, I got to be a leader. I've got to be the CEO. I've got to be this and this and this. And if people think that I failed and that I made mistakes and I show that, they're going to think less of me, which I think is exactly the opposite. I truly do. I think people get closer to that. But how do you, in your role, in consulting and coaching these people outside of the pod, and maybe actually even during the podcast, what do you do? What's your superpower in getting people to feel at least comfortable enough to be vulnerable?
Yeah. So some of it is like probably selection bias, right? Because I'm picking people who, have demonstrated that. I think to back up a little bit, brand is all about, like, as a business, you need to generate awareness, confidence, and trust, right? And if you think about, in terms of my service offerings of what I'm doing now, I'm actually taking what I do on the podcast and making that kind of an executive brand and leadership transformation service, right? And there's other things, but I'm sharing that specifically because what's interesting is when I did my interview with the CEO at the time, the CEO of Logitech, he's won the Edison Award that led a phenomenal transformation at the company and has done countless TV shows and interviews. And the response from one of the leaders there was, this is the best interview we've ever heard on his leadership journey. And so they made it part of their employee onboarding, right? But I encourage you to go and listen. It's my favorite episode. Sorry to my other guests. but the reason why is the story was a gut punch. It was so powerful. And I hear that over and over again, people saying, I've never shared this story before, right? So something happened though about a month ago where I had on the CEO of Team Rubicon, and he used to be a Top Gun pilot. And so I do my research on all my guests, and I think I know most of the things about them. And inevitably this happens every single time. But I said, tell me about a time something went sideways. So I was thinking it was going to be we hit a bird, or we almost ran out of fuel, or whatever. And he said, the only thing in the original Top Gun movie that was accurate was when they went into a tailspin. And so he was talking about this maneuver they were doing, and his plane went into a tailspin for 51 seconds. Engines went out, 51 seconds, hurtling towards the desert floor. He has to eject, and 16,000 pounds of fuel fireball below him. And then he has to, move the parachute so he doesn't land in the middle of this fireball, right? So he shares this story, and he ultimately went through a very long process, and majority of the fault was not his. He had responsibility, but it was mechanical errors and the ground crew and things like that, right? So I posted a clip from this. And what's fascinating is you think about executive brand and a lot of the work people do in that area, it's very much a veneer. Like, how do I make myself look good? Let me hire an agency to post for me 4 times a month to make me look really smart. And you read it and it's not from them anyway, right? This, in my mind, is the most powerful example of true executive brand. Like, if we're thinking about confidence and trust, that I've, ever seen. So I posted this clip, and person after person after person from across his career. Like, you think about, you do a 360 within your company and get feedback from the people around you. Think about doing that across your entire career, right? So people from 20 years ago are talking about how he transformed their career, how they owe him everything, what a phenomenal leader is, right? So that got me thinking is, for one, to your question, he was being highly vulnerable. 2, you think about what he was doing over the past several decades. It was quietly, he wasn't talking about what a great leader he was. I don't think wasn't walking with him, but he was demonstrating it through the way that he led, which is causing these people to come out of the woodwork and talk about that. Right. So I think that piece just illustrated for me the power of that vulnerability, but also when it's grounded in, like, he's earned that. Right. and so it's not a thing where it's like, hey, we just want a leader who's vulnerable. Like, you have to deliver results, right? And so it's kind of bringing those two things together.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good observation, I think, is that you can't just tell the story. You have to kind of back it up. But this is a good connection to another question I wanted to ask you, and that's around your kind of passion project. And it's around veterans and mental health. I believe if you can share a little bit more about that, the organization, what it stands for, and what it means to you.
Yeah. So and this is online, and I'm comfortable sharing it, obviously, because I am. But I have what's called complex PTSD. When I left Amazon, I was suicidal on a weekly basis, or having suicidal thoughts on a weekly basis. And at one point in 2015, 15, I believe it was, I almost took my life about a mile from here at the river that goes through Fall City, and went through like years and years of hard work to get out of that. But one of the things that was super healing for me was upriver from that exact spot. One of the most magical healing times for me was fly fishing. I right around then started fly fishing, and that was super transformative for me. So on that same river where I almost took my life, I found this thing that gave life, right? And so around that, so my dad was a veteran. I grew up going to veterans hospitals and seeing all of the suffering there. And so I really started looking at a way to how do I bring the fly fishing piece together, the mental health piece together, and give back. And so a friend referred me to the founder of the BarX project. So essentially what we do is we put on trips in Montana, all expense paid trips for combat wounded Marines and corpsmen, and bring back folks who fought together. So we bring their units back together and then take them fly fishing. And then there's also mental health coaching and some mentorship and things like that. And what's really powerful is just, for one, just getting in that environment where you're pulled out of your everyday. And then again, that it's medicine being on the water, fly fishing. And we hear that over and over again. But two is seeing so I do all of most of the storytelling. And so I have the privilege of interviewing these folks who have done just phenomenal things. But this one gentleman, I remember, going to the piece around narrative, is he said that for, 12, 14 years, he's cut himself off from these guys who were his best friends because his narrative was that he wasn't as good as they were, that he was less than them. So he cut himself off, which, imagine all the pain and harm that he caused himself by doing that. And he said by coming on this experience within a matter of minutes, he said that lie was just gone, right? And he said it was just like we were back there. And so that narrative shift and transformation, like that's everything for me. That's what I'm most passionate about.
Wow, that is that is amazing, Chris. Thank you for sharing that. On that note, we are going to take a short break to hear from our corporate sponsors, and when we come back with our guest Chris Hare for our famous, and we've already had Michelle Bomberger plead the fifth section of the show. We're going to put Chris in the DeLorean. He's going to find out when you do. Don't walk away. We'll be right back with more of the Shrimp Tank. And Plead the Fifth is brought to you by our corporate sponsors, Ideal Life 360, Cornerstone Financial, First Underwriters Insurance, BC Fitness Studio, Port Ludlow Resort, and Upstart Group. Please visit our website at shrimptankpodcast.com/Seattle to learn more about these terrific companies. Now back to the show.
Everyone, welcome back to the Shrimp Tank, where we interview the best and brightest CEOs and business thought leaders in the greater Puget Sound area and beyond. I'm Michelle Bomberger here with Dan Whedon and our guest today, Chris Hare. Plead the Fifth is up next.
All right, we're gonna start throwing some real fastballs here now, maybe even a few curves, Chris. We'll see. And now you know how Plead the Fifth works because Michelle did it. You get to plead the fifth, but only once. So we'll see how that works out. But I think we'll have some fun with it. So I'm sure you're familiar with Back to the Future and the DeLorean going back in time. So we're gonna put you in there with Doc Brown and Marty McFly just for a few minutes. And we're going to send you back to when you were 18 years old without messing up the time continuum, because we don't want to do that. Without messing that up, you have about 5 minutes to talk with an 18-year-old Chris, maybe right out of graduation. What's the 5 minutes like? What advice would you give?
I'm going to give the advice that's actually fresh off of my conversation yesterday with Erminia Ibarra, because essentially, so my advice would be, don't become attached to a specific future, but also experiment with a lot of potential futures. So what I talked about with her yesterday from her research on career transition and other things is really where success comes from, is imagining a bunch of different future identities and then running a bunch of experiments and testing those out. Right. So that would be the first piece. The second piece would be you're a creative person. No one around you recognizes it, but embrace that. And there is a place for you in the world. And lean into that. That's what I would say.
Great. What is the most influential book that you've read, either business or non-business, that you feel like everyone should take a read?
So it depends on the type of business, but the one that is my favorite to recommend is The Business of Expertise by David C. Baker. And it is more geared towards like services, businesses, and consultants, and more towards the creative side of things. But it's very much focused on identifying when you get to the right point in your career, what is that one thing that you do better than anyone else? And then how do you, position yourself tight enough that you're going to resonate with your market, and right sizing that, potential target market. And then how do you go after them? So it would be Business of Expertise.
So Chris, in the bio I read you live in Falls City, you have a wife and two teenagers. And I just remember when I had teenage daughters, people would ask all the time, what does your dad do? I'm curious, plead the fifth, or maybe if you know the answer in some way, how do your kids explain to their friends what dad does?
My guess would be my daughter would probably just be like, my dad does some stuff. I mean, maybe she says it's marketing. My son knows pretty clearly what I do. So I think he would actually probably hit the nail on the head for the most part. Although recently I had a podcast interview, and he said to me that evening, he's like, yeah, I heard the beginning of your interview didn't go so well. And I was like, how did you hear that? I have headphones on. And he's like, well, I heard you do this really sharp pivot and say, okay, well, we'll start somewhere else. So he's constantly listening. He has big ears and he's paid attention. So that's probably more than you asked for, but yeah.
That's perfect. That is ideal.
So if you could start another business beyond the one that you're currently in from a hobby, what would that business be?
You said from a hobby?
Mm-hmm.
So it's closely aligned to what I'm doing. But I'll tell you what I'm doing next year with my business that's kind of moving towards that hobby. So maybe that's cheating, but essentially I'm doing what's called narrative on the fly. And so I would make that a business on its own. So because of the transformation that I've seen and the way people open up to tell their stories, the plan is to start taking groups of CEOs to Montana and elsewhere, 8 to 10 CEOs, go fly fishing, and then also tell their stories and kind of within a community. So that would be the thing that I would do. All
right. I've been waiting. This is going to be my last question for you, and I'm very curious. So you're in a dinner party. You're somebody who interviews people. You get stories out of people. I'm curious. You're seated next to somebody that you've never met, and how do you start a genuine conversation that gets you to a point that you can actually learn a little something about that person?
Well, I haven't gotten to plead the fifth, and I'm tempted to, because I've just never been able to plead the fifth anywhere, but I won't plead the fifth. So historically it would have been more around, I try to not ask the obvious question of, what do you do? Right. But that gets there pretty quick. But I think once that surface question of what do you do gives the context of their world. And I think for me, I like to ask pretty quick, what is it that lights people up the most about their work, and kind of asking, and I do that in the podcast as well, as what's that one thing that you could do for 20 hours straight, with time just flies by. Probably wouldn't ask that in a first meeting, but understanding the context. And then what I recommend doing is at the end of the day, what I do is pattern matching, right? And so when you do a lot of listening in the world, you take in all of this data, and then it's about seeing patterns. So being able to quickly listen and see, hey, this is their context, and make connections to ways that I could help them, right? So that's, so for me, you could honestly put me next to almost anyone in the world if we speak the same language, and I'll have some connection or something to talk about with them. Yeah, so that's a fun way to live.
I love that. All right, we're going to wrap up with my last question, which is, what is your reaction to the word impossible?
Like, I mean, the very first words that come to mind is broken narrative. And so, or false narrative, potentially. Like, obviously, there are things that are truly impossible. So we're not talking about that. But in terms of mindset, I'm not saying that anything you think you can do. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is we take stories from the past and our experiences from the past and interpret them and shape a narrative about what is possible and what's not possible. But past is not prologue, right? And so, yeah, that would be my response, is that it's, in some cases it's accurate, some cases it's not. So I would actually probably tweak my answer a little to say it's more about challenging the underlying narrative and potentially rewriting it.
I just wrote down that past is not prologue. I love that.
That's
So,
Mark Stoos. That's his.
all right. Well, as we wrap up, Chris, thank you so much for being a guest here on the Shrimp Tank. For our listeners who want to get in touch with you or learn more about your company, how can they get more information?
Yeah, LinkedIn is a great place, but thestoriedfuture.com is the website. And then if you want a shortcut to get to the podcast, it's tsfpod.com.
Fantastic. For our listeners, check out Chris's podcast, and also make sure you check out all of our replays at shrimptankpodcast.com/Seattle and wherever you get your podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple, and follow our show's social media pages on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. I found this incredibly fascinating and loved hearing from you. And I'm going to be a podcast listener. You're now on my list, so I'll be listening to your podcast. Hope you'll continue to listen to ours. Thanks again for being on, Michelle. As always, I can't believe the next time we're going to be doing this, we're going to be past Thanksgiving. It's amazing to believe how fast time goes. Great to see you, and we'll see you next month. Everybody else, please do exactly what Michelle said. Like us on our Facebook page. That way you can watch us live stream every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific. Our next guest will be on November 1st. It's going to be Christine Nguyen from Pretty Books. Craig Swanson will be my co-host. In the meantime, be safe, be well, and be prosperous, because until next week, the shrimp is back in the tank. So long.
I've been feeling like a shark